Well, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the School for Christian Faith and Leadership at the Diocese of Washington. I am the Reverend Emily Snowden, project coordinator for the school and your digital host for today. We're so glad that you are here for our final session of these Teaching Tuesdays. Today's another wonderful opportunity to learn from our missioner for revitalization, the Reverend Todd Thomas, as he talks with our missioner for equity and justice, Hazel Monae. They're going to be talking about blessing our community, the last of the 7 signs of parish vitality. Again, we're so glad that you're here. I am so glad that you get to meet Hazel. She's a delight to the EDOW staff, and we hope that you enjoy your lunch. So now I'll turn it over to the Reverend Todd Thomas.
Thank you, Reverend Emily. And everybody's using the chat already. So thank you for doing that. And yeah, Mary, we have been picking cicadas off ourselves every time we go outside, ducking and rolling and just not having a good time with it. But welcome as we get going today on the last week that we're going to be together for this series right now. And you know, I have to be honest, it actually did not hit me. Hazel and I were talking about this yesterday. It did not actually come together in my head that our last Tuesday together, May 25th, we were going to be talking about social justice and racial equity on the 1-year anniversary of the murder of George Floyd. And that's sort of like, it just hit me yesterday that I knew both the days were happening. This is how bad I am with math and calendars. It didn't come together that we were doing it on the same day. So as we gather together today to talk about blessing our community, specifically, we're going to be talking about a lot of racial equity and justice issues today. And when we talk about blessing our community, we have often referenced Jeremiah 29 and the idea that Jeremiah presents, which is God's exiled people should invest and put down roots in their local community. And the idea that the prophet gives is that their welfare is the welfare of the city, and the welfare of the city is their welfare. In other words, there is a mutuality even in the community for an exiled people who are not where they want to be, to invest and have that mutual connection and welfare with their communities. Now, we are not an exiled people, however. We are not necessarily forced to be where we don't want to be. So I'm going to read a little bit different passage because we're neighbors, because we're parts of our community, because we're vitally connected in with our communities. I'm actually going to read the Beatitudes, the way that Jesus outlined community for us in Matthew chapter 5 from the Inclusive Bible. And then we'll open with a word of prayer. When Jesus saw the crowds, he went up on a mountainside. And after he sat down and the disciples had gathered around him, Jesus began to teach them. Blessed are those who are poor in spirit. The kingdom of heaven is theirs. Blessed are those who are mourning. They will be consoled. Blessed are those who are gentle. They will inherit the land. Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for justice, for they will have their fill. Blessed are those who show mercy to others, for they will be shown mercy. Blessed are those whose hearts are clean, they will see God. Blessed are those who work for peace, they will be called children of God. Blessed are those who are persecuted because of their struggle for justice. The kingdom of heaven is theirs. And as we gather to talk about our life together on this anniversary of such an unjust and high-profile murder, we begin with the prayer for the human family from the Book of Common Prayer. O God, you made us in your own image and redeemed us through Jesus, your Son. Look with compassion on the whole human family. Take away the arrogance and hatred which infect our hearts. Break down the walls that separate us. Unite us in bonds of love, and work through our struggle and confusion to accomplish your purposes on earth, that in your good time, all nations and races may serve you in harmony around your heavenly throne. Through Jesus Christ our Lord. Amen. As Reverend Emily mentioned, we've been joined by a lot of staff this spring at Church House, which has been wonderful and been a blessing. But a big part of that blessing has been welcoming our new missioner, Hazel Monae, our missioner and I wrote it down so that everybody's titles, we like to say them correctly, right? Hazel is our missioner for equity and justice. And what I'd like to do is just welcome Hazel to introduce herself. Hazel, tell us a little bit about where you're coming from, what you're hoping and dreaming and seeing in your work here with the Episcopal Diocese of Washington, and welcome.
Thanks so much, Todd, and thanks so much, Emily. Hello, everybody. It's good to see some familiar faces and names and to meet you all virtually. And I look forward to any day where I can meet any of you in person. I'm vaccinated, so whenever that time is. So yes, I'm Hazel Monae. I use she, her pronouns, and I'm coming most recently after almost 10 years in the Diocese of Massachusetts, doing a work around racial equity in particular. And I'm really happy to be here in this diocese with, folks I've heard of and been reading about over the years. EDAO has a strong reputation. And I'm really seeing that this vision for justice and equity is really manifest on a few layers. There's the kind of interpersonal level, like how can we individually change the way we think, the way we act, those we partner with, understand, raise our consciousness. So seeing those kinds of things and things like the Sacred Ground curriculum and other anti-racism trainings. Also seeing some really important collaboration with community partners and even some elected officials around things like the support for housing, things around prison ministry and the sanctuary ministry. And then thinking on a systemic level, like how do we quite literally change the system that we're in so that people can thrive? Thinking about things like the reparations task force, which we'll talk a little bit about, I think at some other point, but I'm just really excited to see so many folks and groups working on strategies that will liberate us. And I want to say very quickly how I am defining racial equity. It's a creative process. It is a creative process. It's not just about tearing things apart and tearing things down, but we're creating the conditions where everyone can thrive, wherein we are intentionally, consistently, and systematically creating the conditions for all people, particularly those who are historically negatively racialized. That means racism. We're creating the conditions for them to thrive, for me to thrive. And that racial equity practices fundamentally understand and provide these material supports, transform systems and institutions. And so when I talk about racial equity, it is intersecting. You cannot talk about racial equity without talking about the environment, without talking about housing, without talking about food and all the things. And so I look forward to more conversation and any work that we will do together. I hope that covers it, Todd. I hope that was under 5 minutes.
Absolutely. No, that was fantastic. Thank you. That was under 5 minutes, but I would have given you the full 5. Thank you, Hazel. It is really good to have you with us today and working on staff. And it is just part of why it's such an exciting time to be a part of the Episcopal Diocese of Washington right now. Good things are happening. And this final vital sign in our list of weeks that we're coming together around blessing our community, I want to take just a moment to introduce it to you a little bit more. And then we're going to go into some breakout rooms and have a little bit of discussion to get started. When we talk about blessing our community, I want to read a little bit about what we've written in documentation about this vital sign. We have said a healthy parish advocates for and partners with the local community and other organizations. This engagement focuses on the welfare of our neighbors and justice initiatives, such as food scarcity, racial inequities, and immigration concerns. The parish is invested in the health and well-being of its local community. And it's important to note that when we talk about this vital sign, it is distinguished a bit from other things that we've typically talked about in church, like outreach or evangelism, or even benevolence. some of these other catchwords that we've used and activities that we've engaged in. Blessing our community means that a parish is valuing their role as a good neighbor, and they have a commitment to the common good. And so a parish is going to take action, and they're going to advocate. And it may not ever bring anybody through the door, and it may not be a classical style of evangelism or outreach like we are doing in welcoming and connecting ministries, with tailoring worship to our guests and other things we've talked about. It may not really be engagement with seekers, but it is engagement with neighbors. And if you remember our greatest commands, that's half of the love that we're sent to live. And so parishes, which are vital in part, we believe, because they are committed to the common good and the life of being a good neighbor, the kind of neighbor that everybody wants in the community. So as we go into our breakout groups, I'm going to pop the question here in chat for you to see. It's a little long, but we're going to go over it real quick, and then you can carry it with you. You should be able to see it once you go into the group. What are the justice and racial equity conversations happening around and within your community right now? So you can think about the community where your church is located. You could think as far as within your parish. What are the conversations happening within your community around justice and racial equity? And what work has your parish done to develop its message and response to justice and equity issues? So we kind of want to hear, what is the buzz in your community, and how is the parish responding? Any questions about the question before we go into our breakout groups? All right, fantastic. Thank you. Well, bring the music down here, and I'm going to invite Hazel, if you could bring us up to speed. Most of you were probably very aware. You may have heard Bishop Sutton spoke to us before our convention back in January about the work of reparations in the Diocese of Maryland, and gave us an update on some of their work and how they brought their reparation study together. I would love to get an update from Hazel on our reparations committee work here in the reparations task force in our diocese, and where we might be going forward with that. But first, want to hear back from you on your breakout rooms. What are the issues? What did you share as the conversations around justice and racial equity within your communities and your parish response? Invite somebody to jump in, just unmute and go for it.
We were breakout group 1. Oh, sorry, let me get my video on. So we were breakout group 1, and there were a lot of really interesting things that we talked about. We talked a lot about food pantry, not only having one within your own parish, but merging with another parish to provide more food for their pantry. One of the participants has a daycare at their church that they take care of. One of the participants worked on the neighbor to the church, I believe, Randy, was having flooding. And so the church got involved with the neighborhood in planning some kind of canal or something to reroute the water that was going into this neighbor's property. We talked about also taking advantage of the EDAO anti-racism workshops and book studies and Sacred Ground and Dr. Kendi, book study that our parishes are participating in right now.
Awesome.
Oh, we also, sorry, one more thing, that one of the Merle's Church helps people with rent, with paying their rent if they are not able to afford their rent.
Yeah, the food issues, the rent issues have been highlighted during the pandemic, during the past year, especially. What else would anybody like to share what the conversations and parish responses are? I'm watching for your unmutes.
We've had some good book discussions at All Souls, and I've been part of an ongoing small group on race and privilege. But we have not done sacred ground, and that's something that I hope that we will do at some point. We are in a transition right now. We're hoping to get our interim by August 1st. And so hopefully she will be able to help us engage some of these, particularly as we're working really hard right now to get started on a mission and vision statements. And so hopefully this kind of work will be something that we'll be able to see how it incorporates into our mission and vision.
Awesome. Maybe one more.
I just wanted to add in that our parish, because of the diverse population, has been also quite interested in immigration issues. We do a lot of work with Haiti. And so the announcement of extending the status of Haitians in this country was very welcome news to us just this week. Mm-hmm. So, and while I'm here and I see some different faces, I'm going to do a quick plug. Province 3 of the Episcopal Church is planning a Trail to Truth event for youth. And I'm coordinating the portion of that's going to be here in Diocese of Washington. So if any of your youth groups would like to participate in that's going to be on Saturday, October 9th. It's going to be here in the diocese, and we're going to be zooming in with folks from around the province, and then doing activities together with kids, young people from the diocese. So that's something that's going on this fall. And the theme of it is eyes wide open, hearts ready to move. And we're going to be mostly focusing on unconscious bias.
Thank you, Mary. Plugs are welcome. And I would just mention, we've begun gathering youth workers around the diocese once a month to encourage and to equip and to share news and planning together like that as much as we can. So encourage your parish's youth worker, if they're not involved in those conversations, to be a part of them. We're going to be meeting at Cactus Cantina next month in person around chips and queso, and planning for things like that work. Younger generations, we tend to think of them as very woke because they have a vocabulary that many of us didn't grow up with, and they have an awareness that many of us didn't grow up with on these issues, but they are not at times very much more educated about them than we are. So activities like that for young people are super important. Thank you so much for that. And I'm just going to go ahead and ask Hazel now to come back with us and kind of bring us an update on the reparations and where we're headed, and bring us into that work. Let's get busy with you on it.
Thank you so much. And thanks for those who shared and for all the work that y'all are doing. I think it's really appropriate in that there's alignment and synergy that we're having this conversation on this anniversary, because while we may not have been there, we weren't there, we're not the person or the people who killed George Floyd, we are not absolved. And so that is the work of justice, that just because we weren't there doesn't mean we don't have work to do. And so when we're talking about the reparations work, of course, we were not a part of chattel slavery. In its original iteration, though I would argue that we are a part of it in some refined version today. Part of the work of the Reparations Task Force is to speak truth to the history, and particularly the Episcopal churches and this diocese role in chattel slavery. The group is doing that on a few levels. One is sort of surveying institutions who've done this work, to sort of see what are the best practices, how are people going about this process. The other is doing congregational history projects that will happen on first within 10 parishes to sort of get the ball rolling. To talk about parishes that were created during the colonial era, post-colonial era, and then even more recently, and all of the roles that each of these parishes are playing, because we understand that just to talk about parishes that were created during the colonial era, again, absolves us. What about those who were founded by churches created in the colonial era, and so on and so forth? We're also interested in having this on a diocesan level, right? So there's what happens in individual communities and individual parishes with things like endowment, things like what's happening in that particular neighborhood and in the history of that particular region, but also the creation of the diocese. And so how do we connect those stories? The process is, yes, one about, giving funds and financial resources, but also speaking to the power of spiritual growth and discipleship and what that means for ongoing conversations around reparations that are not just financial, though that is a big part of the conversation. And we know that there's not a single dollar amount that would ever be able to make up for such loss. But part of that is to start to move that needle a little bit. And so one way that we're asking for folks to get involved is to do some of that kind of historical project, the Congregational Historical Project, whether you want to join in the conversation with the Reparations Task Force itself, or just begin to explore on your own. Maybe the Sacred Ground curriculum brought up some stuff for you and your parish, and like, wow, we really want to conduct a sort of a research project here to see what families are, of enslaved folks are connected to our church, and how do we reach out and reach back? What about our endowment? I can guarantee you many of your endowments, if you do have one in your parish, came off the backs of enslaved folks. And so how do we, begin to tell the truth about that history and then move to a place of repair? The second thing that I think would be really important is to do some proactive work. And so often justice is a response, and I understand justice as a process that we're sort of always working toward and striving for. And so part of that is establishing your parish voice. What are your stories? What are your theologies? What do you believe about justice? What do you believe about the oneness of all people and all creation? That we can actually begin to cultivate those stories and those theologies before George Floyd, before all the things, right? And so that what we're doing is, again, creating the conditions where we're all thriving. And so I do invite you all to do one of those two things. What are your histories? Do a congregational history project, connect to community, and then also begin to cultivate your voice. What do you believe? Who are you as a parish in response to this conversation around reparations? I think that's the piece, Todd. Anything else?
Awesome. Any questions about reparations? I don't know if we have anybody from the reparations task force with us today. Okay.
I have a question.
Vicki, yes.
Hi. So how do we start, Vicki from St. Luke's in Brighton, Maryland. How do we ask our people to start these conversations? Does the task force have like a guide of questions that we ask each other or where to start?
Right. Specifically around reparations?
Yes. Yeah. About, congregational history project. Yeah.
Thank you, Vicki. Thank you, Vicki, for that question. So there is sort of a general rubric or kind of here's some questions that we want to be asking. I'm happy to maybe send it to Todd. I don't know who has access to everyone's emails, but we can send that.
We'll include it in the recap doc.
Okay, can do that. And then I'll also say it'd be helpful to get in touch with one of the facilitators, Peter Jarrett Shell, who's been holding these conversations And I'll find his email and drop that in the chat.
Peter is the rector of Calvary, BC. You can look him up that way if you have one of the books.
But Peter, sorry, this is Glenna Hubert.
Yep.
Peter would speak then to reparations. I'm wondering, what I heard Vicky's question to be about was, how do you begin the internal conversation regarding your parish's history? And does EDAL have an archivist that can help with that?
Right.
Would you look in your own archives?
Right.
So that's a great question. So I will still say that Peter would be a part of that, because part of the way we get to the last, like, reparations is like the thing we land at, and then part of how we get there is this history project. So we're hiring a researcher to help sort of say, like, I mean, also we have access to all of these museums and archives here, being in DC. And so that might be a place for folks to start. But I agree with you, Glenna, that maybe I could look into who's a diocesan archivist and figure out if that's a place for folks to begin. But if there are people in your congregations who are themselves historians, that might be a helpful place to begin.
Yeah, definitely. The pandemic year slowed down the reparations work, which has been in place and spun up for a couple of years now, at least. I would add that I know that the diocese has a professional historian and archivist, and I believe they've done all the stateside work there is to be done at that level, and even begun some of the overseas work. You know, some of our records and things do reach overseas to England. But really just to talk to some of the members of our churches, to find out what stories have been handed down and the histories that we have orally, as well as to be able to dig back into records. Some of our churches, you know, I know when I was called to my parish in Bethesda, though it was outside of the Episcopal Church, when I arrived, there had been such discontinuity in record keeping that I routinely stumbled on filing cabinets and boxes of records and things that people didn't know about. So it might be worth a cleaning day to go in and dig into some of those nooks and crannies around the church building and dig out some of those papers and see what was noted. Find out if there was anything written into, I learned this as well, things were often written into bylaws, church property, you know, documents, deeds, and things like that, as to what could happen with the property or where it came from. We may not have that on record yet.
That is so true, because I was a member of the 90th anniversary there at St. George's. And Todd, that's so very true. You will be surprised when you dig deep into those files. I mean, very, very old files. You found so much information that was very helpful to put with the 90th anniversary. And as the congregation that's been there for like years, 80 and 90-year-old members, they was very helpful with information as well, the historical information. So those cabinets, there's many, many, many memories, many.
Yeah, thank you, Lula. And Carolyn, you raised, yeah.
Yeah, I can maybe provide a resource. I'm a trustee with the DC History Center, which has also been known as the Historical Society of Washington. And they have just really good know-how and a network of locally based archivists and historians that can help congregations undertake this kind of work. And we've been using this, we've just started very, very first steps at St. John's Lafayette Square, because we actually have this archive. We have this little room off a stairway that these things have never been processed. They've never been organized. So we're going to start that process. And then the hope is, once we kind of have things cataloged and organized, then to work with a historian to help us tell a story about it. But I would really recommend the DC History Center if folks need just someone to kind of point you in a direction.
Yeah, thank you.
Great.
It's not easy stuff to dig into. Let me just go ahead and put that on the table. The things we find in Episcopal Church history are not very flattering for us, to be honest. And if you've had an opportunity to engage with Stephanie Speller's book, The Church Cracked Open, I highly recommend the book. I did not know that she went into this as much, but she does go into it, and she provides stories of some of the white and Black Episcopalians who stood against the flow of silence when it came to segregation and racism and slavery. There's a lot of culpability within our church history. Now, there's a lot of beautiful energy that's spent at different times and different epochs in our history as well to change, to bring about beloved community. And the call, I think, is to pick that up and make it our own today in stronger ways. Hazel, did you want to highlight any other activities within the diocese or plans or opportunities to get involved?
Yeah, I'll highlight one since you brought up her book. We are so fortunate that Reverend Canon Stephanie Spellers will be joining us on Thursday, June 10th at 6 p.m. via Zoom in conversation with Mildred Reyes, Kevin Antonio Smallwood, and John Harmon, with music by our wonderful Zoe Hillocks, in conversation about this book. And so read it and then prepare for conversation. It's going to be a really great time. And so you'll be seeing really soon here a link to register for that event. And it's called Crack It Open. And so it'll be sort of, what do they call it? Priming the pump for the work ahead. The other things that are forthcoming, I know many congregations are doing individual sacred ground circles, and we're really excited to continue those conversations. We're partnering with someone who's kind of working with the national church to help us think about how we expand that sacred ground for the next work. So often folks will finish up the sacred ground and be like, well, what do I do next? We get that question a lot. And so preparing for sort of a sacred ground 2.0 that still continues some of that deep reflection, but also calls us to deep relationship and action and preparation for what is to come. And so that is also forthcoming. One of those practices kind of to get the ball rolling will be a continuation of like an anti-racism 101 that'll come through the school as well. And that'll start in this summer. And I think that's it for the moment.
Yeah. I know that Reverends Ina Legesse and David Waycaster are diocesan leaders for the Sacred Ground work. And I will mention too, if you didn't know, if you haven't had a Sacred Ground circle held within your parish, we have facilitators prepared to come and do that with you. You don't have to carry that all on your own. So I'm one of the facilitators that went through training, and I've been through 3 Sacred Ground circles in 2 years. Part of that is because it's tough to get stuff through my thick head, so I like to hit it multiple times. But also, I had the opportunity to be in the Sacred Ground group with. We had our resident boomer. I was the Gen Xer, and then it was all millennials, and we actually had one Gen Z. And I was so excited to be in that group with I've been in the all-white Sacred Ground. I've been in the multiracial Sacred Ground. This was the multi-generational Sacred Ground. And that's why I mentioned earlier, our kids, the younger generations, are not any more educated on the history and the impacts and the streams of racism. And oftentimes they're still trapped in that idea that racism is a personal problem and a personal bias and not a systemic situation, which requires a whole different kind of leadership to change and attitude to address. So even though they're way more familiar and comfortable with some of the terminology, they're way more comfortable talking about privilege at times. They're way more, often they almost have a reflex, a genetic awareness that something wrong just happened that would go right over the head of an older generation, but they don't understand why it happened. And so it's a real eye opener for them to go through that. So definitely reach out to Ina Legesse and David Waycaster, or anybody on church house staff can help you connect up with facilitators for that. And I guess I'd open up for any last comments or any other questions.
Here's a question for Hazel. Hazel, if St. John's Lafayette Square wanted to kind of be one of, you kind of were describing some churches in the diocese that were doing kind of intentional looking at their history work that maybe was going to lead to a connection with the reparations work. How would a congregation seek to become part of that effort?
That's it. What you said is really helpful. So the next step would be likely a conversation with someone from the reparations task force to hear a little bit about what your congregation has been up to and what you're hoping for. And then we'll get connected. The group, this is a really good time. The group is starting to form around like the congregations who will kind of be the starter group for these conversations. And so, Carolyn, would you mind? I'll drop my email in the chat if you want to send me an email, and I will get you connected.
Awesome, thank you. All right. Well, thank you again, Hazel, for coming and being with us today. And thank you, everyone. This has been such an enlivening 7 weeks for me personally. I've really enjoyed, and I'm going to miss it. So watch your emails. We'll be getting a recap document out on this week's conversation. We'll have materials and links and things. We will also be getting out a survey from the weeks we spent together and a broader recap document. And watch your emails for the opportunity to get together. I hope to convene us in June around a question on church vitality and continue our conversation. I feel like this is a little bit of a community. And
Exactly.
so you know, everyone who registered for this course, who has dropped in at different times, come and gone, participated, and gets our recap documents, there are about 90 of us, and we represent 46 different parishes across our diocese. So it has been exciting for me to think about the cross section of our regions that this group has represented, the number of parishes we have the potential to touch. Some are just so exciting to me to see them involved. So I want to thank you, especially everybody who is a lay leader vestry member. You have brought a great energy and wisdom to this group. Thank you to our clergy who have come consistently and hung out with us and been a part of the conversations and helped us along the way. It has really been a blessing to be with you. I wanted to end today with a quote from Canon Speller's book. And, I mentioned last week, I kind of flashed it on screen a couple of times and talked about it is such a Pentecost book. And I know Pentecost is a day, not a season, but we can hang on to it for a little bit. She brings Pentecost into her book, and she brings the Spirit, and she brings the idea that we are continuing a great work. So I'd like to end with a quote from her book, and then we're actually going to, our closing prayer will be the last of our baptismal promises that I'll read out, and then all together we will say, I will with God's help. But that quote comes in her chapter called Lose Your Life. She's talking about the self-giving humility of Christ and the self-emptying of Christ. And she makes the bold statement that in Jesus, God shows us what it looks like to be this vulnerable, humble, and self-giving. In him, we see the one who did not run from the things that broke his heart, nor first calculate what he could gain from a situation. And then she goes on to warn us not to say, well, of course, Jesus was able to do that because he's God. She says, no, the same Spirit that Jesus received now rests on anyone who follows him. God invites us into a covenant whereby the power of the Spirit we can choose to allow our hearts to break and then take up the pieces, our lives, our goods, our love, and our privileges, and share it all like a broken loaf of communion bread. So at the end of our journey together, and I invite you to unmute if you want to be unmuted, asking us all together to affirm again, will you strive for justice and peace among all people and respect the dignity of every human being?
I will with
God's help.
Thank you all for being with us through this journey. Thank you all for your input and your spirit and your work in your parishes. And we will see you soon.